Blood stained the linoleum floor of St. Jude's emergency room, but it was the cold steel of a Beretta pressed against Clara's temple that made her freeze. She was just a night shift nurse, overworked, underpaid, and deeply exhausted. But the bleeding man on the gurney wasn't just a patient. He was Dominic Russo, the most ruthless syndicate boss in Chicago. He needed her to save his life tonight. Tomorrow, he would force her into a much deadlier arrangement, becoming his wife to survive a vicious family war. Clara Higgins was a fat woman, a fact she carried with the same pragmatic acceptance as her nursing degree. At 32, she was broad-shouldered, heavy-hipped, and thick around the middle, her thick thighs chafing under the unforgiving fabric of her maroon scrubs. Her weight was a physical anchor in the chaotic world of the St. Jude Medical Center's trauma ward. When she planted her feet, she didn't move, and in a trauma bay, immovable stability was a godsend. It was 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The biting Chicago wind rattled the frosted glass of the ambulance bay doors. Clara leaned against the nurse's station, sipping lukewarm, bitter coffee, trying to ignore the throbbing ache in her lower back. Then the rear security doors, the ones that were supposed to remain magnetically locked, burst open with a deafening crash. 3 men rushed in. 2 of them were dressed in sharp, ruined Armani suits, their faces grim and slick with freezing rain. Between them, they dragged a 3rd man. He was tall, powerfully built, and leaving a thick, dark trail of arterial blood across the pristine white tiles. "Hey!" Clara shouted, her voice booming over the quiet hum of the monitors. "You can't come through!" The taller of the 2 conscious men, a sharp-featured enforcer named Lorenzo, dropped the wounded man's arm and crossed the distance to Clara in 3 terrifyingly fast strides. He didn't speak. He simply drew a suppressed 9mm handgun from his tailored jacket and shoved the cold muzzle hard under Clara's chin. "You are going to fix him," Lorenzo hissed, his accent thick with Southside grit. "No charts, no doctors, no cops. You do it, or I paint this desk with your brains." Clara swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her thick neck. She looked past the gun, her eyes locking onto the man bleeding out on the floor. Dominic Russo. She recognized him from the grainy newspaper clippings pinned in the hospital break room, the untouchable heir to the Russo crime family, a syndicate that controlled the city's docks and half its unions. Dominic's dark hair was plastered to his forehead, his olive skin pale and graying. He had taken a bullet to the upper right chest, dangerously close to the subclavian artery. If he stays on that floor for another 90 seconds, he's going to die. "Gun or no gun," Clara said. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out with clinical authority. "Move him to Trauma Bay 4, now!" Lorenzo hesitated, then lowered the weapon. He and his partner hoisted Dominic onto a gurney and wheeled him into the secluded bay. Clara followed, her heavy rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the blood-slicked floor. The next 40 minutes were a blur of visceral survival. Clara stripped Dominic's shredded $3,000 suit jacket, her large, capable hands moving with practiced efficiency. She was sweating profusely, damp curls clinging to her forehead as she packed the gunshot wound with hemostatic gauze, her heavy frame leaning into his chest to apply brutal, life-saving pressure. Dominic drifted in and out of consciousness. Through the haze of blood loss and agony, his dark, predatory eyes fluttered open. He didn't see an angelic, delicate savior. He saw a large, formidable woman with a double chin, eyes fierce with determination, throwing her entire body weight against his wound to stop him from bleeding to death. "You're crushing me," Dominic rasped, coughing up a fine mist of blood. "I'm keeping your blood inside your body, Mr. Russo," Clara snapped back, not easing up for a second. "Shut up and stay awake. If you pass out, I'm going to slap you." A weak, dark chuckle vibrated in Dominic's chest. "You've got a smart mouth, and you have a bullet in your chest. Let's focus on that." Clara managed to stabilize him. She accessed the hospital's secured pharmacy using Dr. Peter Gable's override code, a corrupt attending physician she knew was on the syndicate's payroll anyway, and administered broad-spectrum antibiotics and 2 units of O-negative blood stolen from the emergency reserves. By 5 a.m., the bleeding had stopped. Dominic was stabilized, stitched up, and resting on the stiff hospital bed. Lorenzo stepped out of the shadows, sliding a thick manila envelope onto the stainless steel counter. "For your silence," Lorenzo said, his tone entirely devoid of gratitude. "I don't want your blood money," Clara said, wiping her blood-stained hands on a towel, her chest heaving with exhaustion. "Take it," Dominic's voice cut through the room. It was raw, yet it carried an undeniable command. He was propped up on his good elbow, staring at her intently. "You saved my life tonight, nurse. What's your name?" "Clara." "Clara." He tasted the name, his eyes raking over her wide, exhausted figure. "Keep the money, Clara, and forget you ever saw me." By the time the morning shift arrived, the Russo men were gone. The floor was mopped with bleach, the gauze incinerated. Clara went home to her cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, took a scalding shower, and collapsed into bed, assuming she had survived her one and only collision with the Chicago underworld. She was devastatingly wrong. 3 days later, the real nightmare began. Clara was walking to her bruised 2011 Honda Civic in the hospital's dimly lit parking structure. The Chicago air was bitter, biting through her oversized wool coat. As she fumbled for her keys, 2 black Cadillac Escalades materialized from the shadows, their headlights blinding her. Tires screeched as they boxed her car in. Panic seized her chest. She turned to run, but Lorenzo was already there, blocking her path. "The boss wants a word, Clara," he said, gesturing to the rear door of the lead SUV. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs. She was a heavy woman. Running was not going to save her, and fighting a mob hitman was out of the question. With a deep, shuddering breath, she walked to the car and slid into the back seat. The interior smelled of rich leather, expensive scotch, and copper. Dominic Russo sat in the corner, his arm in a sophisticated black sling. He looked much better than he had on her operating table. He was devastatingly handsome in a brutal, uncompromising way. Sharp jaw, aristocratic nose, and eyes as cold and black as obsidian. "Clara," Dominic said smoothly, pouring a splash of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. "I hope Lorenzo wasn't too rough. We have a pressing matter to discuss." "If this is about the money, I haven't spent a dime," Clara stammered, gripping her purse tightly on her wide lap. "It's still in the envelope. This isn't about the money. This is about my uncle, Salvatore." Dominic took a slow sip of his drink. "The bullet you pulled out of me?" Salvatore ordered the hit. "My grandfather, the patriarch of this family, died 2 weeks ago. He left the controlling shares of the Chicago Port Authority, billions of dollars in shipping routes, to me. But there is a stipulation in the will." Clara stared at him, bewildered. "Why are you telling me this? I'm a nurse. I don't care about your Mafia politics." Dominic's lips curled into a half-smile. "You will care. The stipulation is that I must be settled to inherit the ports. Married. Grounded. Salvatore is petitioning the family commission, claiming I am a volatile, reckless bachelor who gets shot in back alleys. If I am not married by the family gala this Saturday, Salvatore takes control. And if Salvatore takes control, my entire faction, including me, will be slaughtered. So find a mob princess and get married, Clara said, her patience thinning despite her fear. What does this have to do with me? Dominic leaned forward, the predatory intensity in his eyes making Clara press her broad back against the leather seat. A mob princess is a liability. Their families want power. They spy. They scheme. I need a woman with no ties to this world. Someone practical. Someone who doesn't panic when a gun is in her face. Someone who can stitch up a bullet wound without flinching. Clara's blood ran cold. No, absolutely not. We will be married on paper, Dominic continued, ignoring her refusal. You will move into my estate in Lake Forest. You will attend public events as my wife. You will smile, wear the rings, and pretend to be deeply in love with me for exactly 1 year until my inheritance is irrevocably secured. In exchange, you will receive $5 million. Clara let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. The sound filled the tense air of the SUV. Look at me, Mr. Russo. Seriously, look at me. I am a size 20. I buy my scrubs from a specialty catalog. I have a double chin, and I sweat when I climb 2 flights of stairs. You are a billionaire mafia boss. No one on God's green earth is going to believe you fell madly in love with the fat, graveyard shift nurse. Dominic's gaze didn't waver. His eyes slowly traveled over her face, her heavy shoulders, her wide hips beneath the coat. They will believe it because I will make them believe it. My world is filled with plastic women starving themselves to fit into sample sizes, whispering poison into each other's ears. You are real, Clara. You are solid. You saved my life. The narrative writes itself. The ruthless Don humbled and saved by the fiercely capable, grounded nurse. I said no, Clara said, her voice dropping to a stubborn growl. I'm not dying in a mob war. Dominic sighed, setting his glass down. I didn't want to use leverage, Clara, because I genuinely respect you. But I am fighting for my life. He pulled a thin iPad from the seat pocket and handed it to her. Clara looked at the screen. It was a ledger. Her younger brother's name, Tommy Higgins, was at the top. Beneath it was a staggering debt of $450,000 to an illegal sports betting ring run by the Irish mob. Tommy has been a very foolish boy, Dominic said softly. The O'Callaghan crew is going to break his legs by Friday and cut his throat by Sunday. If you say yes, I wipe the debt tonight. Tommy walks free. Your family is protected. You get $5 million in 12 months. Clara stared at the screen, a nauseating wave of dread washing over her. Tommy was an idiot, but he was her only brother. Her mother would not survive burying him. She looked at Dominic, her eyes brimming with angry, humiliated tears. He was cornering her, trapping her in a gilded, blood-soaked cage. You're a monster, she whispered. I am a survivor, Dominic corrected, his tone turning cold. Just like you. So, Clara, will you be my wife? Clara looked down at her thick, calloused hands. She had spent her whole life making practical, difficult choices. This was just another shift in the trauma ward. Saturday, she said, her voice hollow. But if you ever threaten my brother again, I won't save you the next time you take a bullet. Dominic smiled, a chilling, genuine expression. Deal. The transformation of Clara Higgins was a frantic, 3-day military operation disguised as a bridal makeover. She was pulled from her cramped apartment and thrust into Dominic's sprawling, fortified mansion in Lake Forest. Teams of stylists, tailors, and manicurists swarmed her. Clara firmly rejected the stylists' attempts to squeeze her into suffocating corsets or drape her in shapeless, tent-like fabrics designed to hide her flaws. "I am fat," Clara told a terrified Italian tailor on Friday afternoon. "I am not a secret you can sweep under a rug. If Dominic wants them to believe he chose me, I'm going to look like I belong here. Give me structure. Give me a waist. Do not hide me." When Clara descended the grand staircase of the Russo estate on Saturday evening for the engagement gala, she commanded the room. She wore a custom-tailored, deep emerald green velvet gown with a sweetheart neckline that accentuated her heavy, soft curves and ample bust. A diamond choker, worth more than the hospital she worked at, rested against her collarbone. She was large, undeniably so, but she moved with the grounded, majestic confidence of a woman who routinely wrestled drunk patients into submission. Dominic waited at the bottom of the stairs, dressed in a flawless midnight blue tuxedo. When he looked up at her, Clara saw a flicker of genuine surprise cross his stoic features. For a brief second, the Mafia boss looked entirely disarmed. He offered his hand. Clara took it, his grip warm and firm against her cold skin. "You look—" Dominic hesitated, searching for the word. "Formidable, mia cara." "I look like a target," Clara muttered under her breath, pasting on a smile as the flash bulbs of syndicate-approved photographers popped around them. The ballroom was a den of vipers dressed in haute couture. The air was thick with cigar smoke, expensive perfume, and lethal tension. Clara felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. She heard the whispers. She saw the sneers from the razor-thin mob wives and the calculating stares from the capos. They were dissecting her her origin, her absolute lack of pedigree. Then the sea of tailored suits parted, and Salvatore Russo approached. Salvatore was in his late 60s, a silver-haired shark with a deceptively warm smile. He flanked himself with 3 heavily armed guards. "Dominic," Salvatore purred, pulling his nephew into a tight, aggressive embrace. "And this must be the miraculous Clara, the nurse." Salvatore pulled back and looked Clara up and down. His gaze was intentionally insulting, lingering on her wide waist and thick arms. "I must admit, Dominic, when I heard you were settling down, I expected someone a bit more refined, someone who fits our world. Tell me, Clara, do you know anything about logistics, shipping, the pressures of leading an empire?" Clara felt Dominic's hand tighten imperceptibly on her waist. He was about to step in, but Clara beat him to it. "I know how to manage a level 1 trauma ward when 5 gunshot victims roll in at 2 a.m., Salvatore," Clara said loudly, her voice clear and carrying over the quiet music. She didn't use a respectful title. She looked the old Don dead in the eye. "I know how to stop bleeding, manage chaos, and keep people alive when the world goes to hell. Dominic has enough people in his life who know about shipping. He needed someone who knows how to keep him breathing." A tense, stunned silence rippled through the immediate circle. No one spoke to Salvatore Russo like that. Dominic let out a low, dark laugh, pulling Clara closer to his side. "She has a spine of steel, Uncle," Dominic said smoothly. "Exactly what a Don needs in a wife." Salvatore's smile tightened into a grimace. "We shall see. A strong spine can still be broken." The gala resumed, the tension simmering just below boiling point. Clara stayed by Dominic's side, playing the part of the devoted, unexpected lover. But the facade shattered exactly an hour later. Clara was standing near the grand buffet when a sudden, sickening gasp echoed from the VIP lounge. It was Isabella, Dominic's 18-year-old sister. She had collapsed against a velvet sofa, her hands clawing desperately at her throat. Her face was rapidly turning a terrifying shade of cyanotic blue, her eyes wide with panic. The room erupted into chaos. Guards drew weapons, assuming an attack. Dominic pushed through the crowd, dropping to his knees beside his sister. "Isabella, someone get a doctor. Call an ambulance." "They jammed the cell signals," Lorenzo yelled, holding up a useless phone. "Nobody in or out." Clara didn't hesitate. She kicked off her 3-inch heels and shoved her way through the wall of armed mobsters, her heavy frame parting the violent men like water. "Move!" she roared. Shoving Lorenzo aside, she dropped heavily onto her knees next to Isabella. She grabbed the girl's jaw, forcing her mouth open. "Her airway is swelling shut. Anaphylaxis or a fast-acting poison. What did she eat?" "Just wine and a crostini," Dominic shouted, panic finally cracking his icy demeanor. Clara checked Isabella's pulse. It was faint and racing. The girl was seconds away from full respiratory arrest. Clara looked at the lavish table, her eyes scanning the ice buckets, the cutlery, the decorations. "I need an EpiPen, now!" Clara screamed. "We don't have one," a bodyguard yelled back. "Then I need a sharp knife, high-proof alcohol, and a hollow tube, a hard plastic straw, a hollowed-out pen, right now," Clara commanded. Dominic didn't question her. He grabbed a steak knife from the table, grabbed a bottle of Belvedere vodka, and snapped the ink cartridge out of a gold Mont Blanc pen, handing the pieces to Clara. "Hold her head still," Clara ordered Dominic. "If she moves, I'll sever her carotid, and she dies right here." Dominic gripped his sister's head, his hands shaking slightly. Clara poured the vodka over her own hands and the knife blade. She didn't have time for fear. She was back in the trauma bay. She found the cricothyroid membrane on Isabella's neck, a small indentation just below the Adam's apple. The crowd of hardened killers watched in absolute, horrified silence as the fat, underestimated nurse pressed the blade into the heiress's throat. Clara made a precise, horizontal incision. Blood welled up, bright and red. Isabella convulsed weakly, but Dominic held her steady. Clara pushed the hollow gold pen casing into the incision, opening the airway. A sharp, wet hiss filled the air as Isabella's lungs finally drew in oxygen. The blue tint slowly began to recede from the girl's lips. She took another, rattling, mechanical breath through the pen. Clara slumped back onto her heels, her chest heaving, the emerald velvet of her dress stained with drops of Isabella's blood. She looked up and locked eyes with Salvatore, who was standing at the edge of the circle, looking perfectly composed. Too composed. Dominic saw the look too. The realization dawned on him instantly. Salvatore hadn't tried to kill Dominic tonight. He had tried to kill Isabella to break Dominic emotionally before the commission vote. Dominic stood up slowly. The vulnerability in his face vanished, replaced by an aura of pure, murderous rage. But before he looked at his uncle, he looked down at Clara. She was kneeling on the floor, barefoot, covered in blood, breathing heavily, keeping his sister alive. She wasn't just a prop anymore. She had just become the most valuable asset in the Russo family. Dominic reached down, offering his hand to his bleeding, disheveled, magnificent fiancé. "Lorenzo," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Lock the doors. No one leaves this house tonight." The heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom slammed shut with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. The click of the deadbolts engaging sent a collective shudder through Chicago's most dangerous elite. Clara remained on the floor, her broad knees aching against the hardwood, her fingers firmly stabilizing the gold pen in Isabella's throat. She ignored the murmurs of the crowd and the click of safeties being disengaged. Her entire world was the weak, thready pulse beneath her blood-stained fingertips. 10 minutes later, Dr. Peter Gable sprinted into the ballroom, his medical bag swinging wildly. He froze at the sight of the blood, the mobsters, and the furious glare of his hospital's most formidable night nurse. "Gable!" Clara barked, her voice slicing through the tension. "Stop staring and get over here. I need a proper tracheostomy kit, an IV push of epinephrine, and high-dose corticosteroids. Now!" Gable scrambled to obey, treating Clara not as a mobster's fiancée, but as the commanding force she was at St. Jude's. Once Isabella was stabilized and carried out by Gable and Lorenzo to the estate's secure medical wing, Clara finally stood up. She wiped her bloody hands on a linen napkin, her chest heaving, the adrenaline slowly receding to leave a cold, hyper-focused clarity. Dominic stood in the center of the room. He had not drawn a weapon, but he didn't need to. The sheer, radiating violence rolling off him kept the room entirely silent. "Someone in this room," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register, "tried to murder my sister. You have 5 minutes to give me a name, or I start executing capos." Salvatore sighed, stepping forward with a theatrical look of sorrow. "Dominic, please. This is a tragedy, but we cannot lose our heads. It was likely a severe allergic reaction. The girl is fragile." "It wasn't an allergy," Clara interrupted loudly. Every eye in the room snapped to her. She was a striking, intimidating sight. Barefoot, her heavy frame planted firmly on the floor. The emerald velvet of her dress smeared with blood. Clara walked toward the buffet table, ignoring the armed men who stepped out of her way. She looked at the abandoned plates and glasses. "Anaphylaxis requires prior sensitization," Clara explained, her tone purely clinical, demanding absolute attention. "Isabella is 18. She has no history of severe food allergies. Dominic told me her medical history for the estate files. Furthermore, the onset was too rapid for a standard foodborne allergen. This was an introduced toxin, a fast-acting paralytic or a concentrated synthetic." She scanned the floor near the velvet sofa where Isabella had collapsed. She spotted it, a shattered crystal champagne flute. Clara crouched down, her thick thighs pressing against the fabric of her gown. She didn't touch the glass, but leaned in close. Clara's clinical assessment. The vector. Isabella ate from a communal buffet, yet no one else collapsed. The toxin wasn't in the food. The delivery. The champagne was poured from a communal bottle. Therefore, the poison wasn't in the bottle. The target. It had to be localized to Isabella. "Look at the rim," Clara pointed. Dominic knelt beside her, his dark eyes following her finger. There was a faint, milky residue smeared along the edge of the crystal, barely visible against the gold leaf pattern. A contact poison, painted directly onto the rim of her specific glass before the pour. Dominic stood slowly. "Who served my sister?" Silence. Clara stood up, her eyes sweeping over the line of terrified catering staff pressed against the far wall. She wasn't looking for guilt. She was looking for physiology. "Guilt is an emotion. Fear is a physiological response," Clara murmured to Dominic. "Look at them. They're all scared. But look at the third server from the left." Dominic's eyes tracked to a young, thin man in a crisp white uniform. "He's profusely diaphoretic, sweating heavily despite the air conditioning," Clara analyzed coldly. "His breathing is shallow and rapid, but most importantly, look at his neck. His carotid artery is pulsing so hard you can see it from 10 feet away. Severe tachycardia. He's in a state of extreme sympathetic nervous system arousal. He's in fight or flight." Dominic didn't say a word. He gave a microscopic nod to Lorenzo. Before the waiter could even gasp, Lorenzo had him by the throat, slamming him onto the center of the dining table, scattering silver platters and caviar. "Who gave you the glass?" Dominic asked, walking slowly toward the terrified boy. "I don't know," the waiter sobbed, his eyes darting wildly. "He wore a mask in the kitchen. He said he'd kill my mother." The waiter's frantic eyes involuntarily flicked toward the right side of the room, toward Salvatore. It was a split-second glance, but in the Mafia, a glance was a confession. Salvatore's face darkened. Before Dominic could speak, Salvatore drew a silver-plated revolver from his jacket and fired a single shot. The deafening crack echoed through the ballroom as the waiter's chest caved, his body going limp on the table. Women screamed. Guns were instantly drawn, half pointing at Salvatore, half pointing at Dominic. "He was a traitor," Salvatore declared smoothly, holstering the weapon, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of genuine panic. "He poisoned my niece. I merely dispensed family justice." Clara stared at Salvatore, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had silenced the only witness. Dominic stepped directly in front of his uncle, their faces inches apart. "You are an old, desperate dog, Salvatore. You missed my heart 3 days ago. You missed my sister tonight. You are losing your touch. Prove it," Salvatore whispered back, a venomous smile on his lips. "Without proof, the Commission will never let you touch me. And if you don't marry that creature by tomorrow, I take the ports. And then I take your head." Dominic turned away from him, his jaw clenched tight. He looked at Clara, his eyes entirely stripped of the charming Mafia don persona. He looked tired. He looked like a man fighting a war on all fronts. "Lorenzo, clear the room," Dominic commanded, "and call the bishop. The wedding is moved to tomorrow morning." The morning of the wedding was a bleak, overcast Saturday. Lake Michigan churned with grey, violent waves, reflecting the mood inside the Russo compound. Clara sat in front of a gilded vanity mirror, staring at her reflection. She looked magnificent, and she hated it. Her gown was a masterpiece of ivory Mikado silk, specifically engineered to support and celebrate her heavy curves. It featured a structured bodice, off-the-shoulder sleeves that draped elegantly over her thick upper arms, and a sweeping A-line skirt. She looked like a queen. She felt like a hostage. The door opened with a soft click, and Dominic walked in. He wore a bespoke black three-piece suit, a silver tie resting against his crisp white shirt. He looked at Clara in the mirror, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath hitch. "You look beautiful," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. "I look like a woman about to marry a mobster," Clara replied dryly, not turning around. "How is Isabella?" "Breathing on her own. Dr. Gable says she will make a full recovery, thanks entirely to you." Dominic walked up behind her, placing his large hands on her bare shoulders. His touch was warm, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. "I owe you my life. I owe you my sister's life. 5 million is no longer enough. Whatever you want, Clara. When this year is over, name your price, and it is yours." Clara looked up at his reflection. "I want my brother to live a long, boring life, and I want to go back to my hospital." "Done," Dominic swore. He reached into his pocket and produced a velvet box, opening it to reveal a staggering diamond necklace. He clasped it around her thick neck, his fingers grazing her skin. "But for today, you are a Russo, and the Russos do not show fear." The ceremony took place in the estate's grand solarium. The guest list had been brutally purged. Only the inner circle and the 5 heads of the Chicago Commission were present. Don Moretti, the ancient, wheezing head of the commission, sat in the front row, holding the leather-bound ledger that contained the transfer deeds for the Port Authority. Salvatore sat in the second row, his face a mask of polite indifference. When Clara walked down the aisle, There was no music. There was only the heavy, rhythmic sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor. She held her head high, her broad shoulders pulled back. She refused to shrink. She met the judging eyes of the commission bosses with the exact same deadpan stare she used on belligerent, intoxicated patients. Dominic took her hands at the altar. His grip was an anchor. The bishop rushed through the Latin rites, clearly terrified. When it came time for the vows, Dominic didn't recite the traditional script. He looked directly into Clara's eyes. "I take you, Clara, not just as my wife, but as my equal. Dominic said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. You are the foundation of my house. You are the armor I wear. With my life, I protect yours. Clara swallowed hard. It was theater. It had to be theater. But the raw, unyielding conviction in his eyes made her heart race. I take you, Dominic, Clara replied, her voice remarkably steady. I will stand by you. I will mend what is broken. I will not break. They exchanged heavy platinum bands. The bishop quickly pronounced them husband and wife. Dominic leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a chaste, theatrical peck. His lips pressed hard and warm against hers, a claiming, desperate kiss that sent a jolt of electricity straight to her toes. When they pulled apart, Don Moretti stood up, leaning heavily on a cane. The stipulation is met, Moretti wheezed, signaling his underboss to bring forward the ledger. Dominic Russo is settled. The ports remain his. A ripple of applause broke out, led by Lorenzo. Salvatore clapped slowly, his eyes locked on Clara. A toast, Salvatore suddenly announced, stepping into the aisle. He gestured to two of his own men, who stepped forward carrying silver trays laden with crystal flutes of champagne. To my nephew and his magnificent, resourceful bride, may you have a long, healthy life. The trays were passed around to the high table. Dominic took a glass. Clara took hers. Something felt violently wrong. Clara looked at the flute in her hand. The crystal was flawless. There was no milky residue on the rim. She looked at Dominic's glass. Clean. She looked at Salvatore. The old man was smiling, holding his own glass up. But he wasn't looking at Dominic. He was looking at Don Moretti, who was gratefully accepting a glass from the tray. He wouldn't, Clara thought, her mind racing. He wouldn't poison the head of the commission unless he was framing Dominic for it. If Moretti died of poison at Dominic's wedding, poured from Dominic's reserves, the commission would execute Dominic before nightfall. Salvatore would inherit the entire empire by default. Clara's eyes snapped to the waiter holding the tray in front of Moretti. The waiter's thumb was resting awkwardly near the rim of Moretti's glass, wearing a thin, nearly invisible flesh-colored latex fingercot. "Don Moretti, wait!" Clara shouted, her voice booming like a foghorn. Moretti froze, the glass inches from his lips. Clara didn't hesitate. She threw her heavy silk skirts aside and lunged forward with surprising speed for a woman her size. She slapped the crystal flute entirely out of Moretti's hand. The glass shattered against the marble floor, the champagne violently fizzing and bubbling against the stone. The room exploded. "What is the meaning of this?" Moretti roared, his guards instantly drawing their weapons on Clara. Dominic stepped directly in front of Clara, shielding her body with his own, his hand hovering over his concealed weapon. "Lower your guns, now!" "She just attacked the Don," Salvatore yelled, feigning outrage. "Kill them both!" "Look at the floor," Clara yelled over the chaos, pointing at the spilled champagne. Where the champagne had pooled on the marble, a strange, rapid chemical reaction was occurring. The liquid was turning a dark, sickly purple, eating away at the finish of the stone. Digitalis mixed with a highly concentrated corrosive, Clara stated loudly, her voice trembling but authoritative. "It causes instant cardiac arrest, mimicking a heart attack in an elderly man. Look at the waiter's thumb." Lorenzo didn't wait for an order. He grabbed the waiter's hand, yanking it up for the room to see. The flesh-colored latex cot was stained faintly purple. Don Moretti stared at the hissing puddle of champagne, his face draining of color. He slowly turned his head to look at Salvatore. Salvatore's mask finally slipped. The polite, grieving uncle vanished, replaced by a cornered, feral animal. He didn't try to explain. He reached for his gun. But Dominic was faster. Before Salvatore could clear his holster, Dominic drew his weapon and fired 3 rapid shots. Bang, bang, bang! Salvatore fell backward, crashing into the wooden pews, dead before he hit the ground. The solarium plunged into a deafening, ringing silence. Smoke drifted lazily from the barrel of Dominic's gun. He didn't look at his dead uncle. He turned around and looked at Clara. She was standing tall, her ivory dress pristine, her chest rising and falling heavily. She had just saved his life, his emperor, and the head of the commission in a single, calculated move. Don Moretti exhaled a long, shaky breath. He looked at the dead body of Salvatore, then at Clara. "Dominic," Moretti wheezed, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Your wife is terrifying." Dominic holstered his gun and reached out, pulling Clara flush against his side. His eyes burned with a mixture of dark pride and dangerous adoration. "Yes," Dominic said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "She is." The cleanup of a Mafia hit is a startlingly efficient process, stripped of any cinematic glamour. Within 20 minutes, Salvatore's body was wrapped in heavy industrial canvas and carried out through the servants' entrance. The shattered crystal and toxic champagne were neutralized with industrial solvent and mopped away. Don Moretti had departed with a curt nod to Dominic and a look of lingering terror directed at Clara. The commission was secure. The ports were secured. The war was over before it could spill into the streets of Chicago. Clara stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the solarium, watching the rain violently lash against the glass. Her ivory silk dress felt 10 pounds heavier than it had an hour ago. The adrenaline that had kept her sharp and hyper-focused was rapidly draining away, leaving behind a deep, bone-aching exhaustion. Her hands, which had remained perfectly steady while holding a knife to Isabella's throat and slapping a poisoned glass across a room, were now shaking uncontrollably. Dominic approached her quietly. He had removed his suit jacket and unbuttoned his collar, the silver tie discarded somewhere in the chaos. He stopped a foot away, giving her space, his dark eyes analyzing the tremors in her broad shoulders. "It's the adrenaline crash," Clara said, her voice raspy, trying to preempt his concern. She crossed her thick arms over her chest, digging her fingers into her own flesh to stop the shaking. "Sympathetic nervous system depletion. I just need a minute, and maybe a cup of black tea with an absurd amount of sugar." "You need more than tea, Clara," Dominic said softly. He stepped into her personal space, his large, warm hands gently enveloping her trembling ones. He didn't pull her into a forced, dramatic embrace. He simply anchored her, lending her his physical stability, just as she had lent him hers in the trauma bay. "I didn't kill him," Clara whispered, staring at his chest. "But I pointed the gun. I analyzed the room, found the threat, and I handed him to you to be executed. I crossed a line today. You saved an innocent old man from being murdered. You saved my family from being slaughtered," Dominic corrected, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. He lifted one of her hands and pressed a long, reverent kiss to her knuckles. "You didn't cross a line, Clara. You built a wall, and you stood in front of the people you swore to protect." He gently turned her away from the window. "Come. You have been in armor long enough." Dominic led her up the grand staircase to the master wing of the estate, a sprawling suite of dark wood, deep velvet, and sweeping views of the stormy lake. He guided her to the edge of the massive king-sized bed and gently pushed her by the shoulders until she sat down. Clara let out a heavy sigh, immediately reaching down to unbuckle her punishing 3-inch heels. "My feet are going to stage a violent rebellion," she muttered, tossing the shoes aside. Dominic knelt on the plush rug in front of her. He took her right foot in his hands, his thumbs pressing deeply into her bruised arches, massaging the cramped muscles with a firm, practiced pressure. Clara let out an involuntary groan of relief, her head falling back against her heavy shoulders. "Better?" he asked, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "If you keep doing that, I might actually believe this marriage is real," Clara murmured, her eyes closed. The massage stopped. The silence in the room shifted, growing heavier, charged with a sudden, suffocating intensity. Clara opened her eyes to find Dominic staring up at her from his knees. "The contract was a necessity," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a low, rough register. "But the vows I took today were not." Clara swallowed hard, her pulse picking up a frantic rhythm. She was deeply aware of her size in that moment, how she took up so much space on the bed, the thick curve of her thighs beneath the silk, the soft, heavy weight of her stomach. In her 32 years, men had appreciated her humor, her competence, and her paycheck. But they had rarely looked at her with the raw, consuming hunger that was currently burning in Dominic Russo's eyes. "Dominic," Clara warned, her voice wavering slightly. "You don't have to play the part behind closed doors. You got the ports, you're safe. Don't patronize me." Dominic stood up slowly. He stepped between her knees, his hands reaching around to the back of her dress. With agonizing slowness, he began to unfasten the intricate row of silk buttons that ran down her spine. "I have never patronized you, Clara," he murmured, his breath hot against her neck as the heavy silk bodice began to loosen. "From the moment I woke up in that trauma bay and saw you fighting the Reaper for my soul, I knew exactly what you were. You think I don't see you? You think I'm blind to your strength, your brilliant mind, your magnificent body?" He pushed the heavy silk sleeves off her shoulders, letting the top of the dress fall to her waist. Clara was left in her supportive, structured corset, her pale skin flushed, her ample chest rising and falling rapidly. She instinctively moved to cross her arms over her stomach, a deeply ingrained habit of self-concealment. Dominic caught her wrists gently but firmly. He pulled her arms away, refusing to let her hide. "Do not shrink from me," Dominic commanded softly, his eyes tracing the soft, generous curves of her body with absolute reverence. "I spend my life surrounded by hollow people who break at the first in of pressure. You are solid. You are real. You are the most beautiful, formidable woman I have ever known, and you belong to me as much as I belong to you." He leaned down and pressed his mouth to the curve of her neck, his hands resting heavily on her wide hips. Clara let out a shuddering breath, her hands coming up to grip his broad shoulders. The clinical, pragmatic nurse vanished, melting under the heat of a man who worshipped the very ground her heavy feet walked on. That night, the contract was tillantly, irrevocably shredded. The marriage was sealed not in blood or ink, but in the dark, desperate passion of two survivors finding safe harbor in each other's arms. 6 months later, the West Loop of Chicago was undergoing a rapid gentrification, but there were still pockets of industrial grit that the city hadn't quite paved over. Warehouse 42 was one of them. From the outside, It looked like a defunct textile factory. Inside, it was a state-of-the-art, fully staffed, heavily fortified trauma clinic. Clara Russo walked briskly down the pristine, brightly lit corridor, her heavy rubber-soled nursing clogs squeaking against the polished concrete. She wore custom maroon scrubs that fit her perfectly, a stethoscope draped around her neck, and a 3-carat flawless diamond on her left ring finger that aggressively caught the fluorescent lights. "Nurse Higgins, Mrs. Russo," a young resident doctor stammered, hurrying to keep up with her long, purposeful strides. "Bed 3 is stabilized. Gunshot to the calf, through and through. No arterial damage." "Good," Clara said briskly. "Give him a broad-spectrum antibiotic. Stitch it up, and tell him if he shoots himself while cleaning his own weapon again, I'm going to charge him double for the gauze. Clear him out." "Yes, ma'am." Clara pushed through the swinging doors into the clinic's administrative office and sighed, tossing a chart onto the desk. The $5 million Dominic had promised her had sat untouched in an offshore account for exactly 2 weeks before Clara figured out what to do with it. She hadn't spent it on yachts or designer bags. She had bought this warehouse. She had used the Russo family's ironclad control over the Chicago Port Authority to import top-tier medical equipment without the crushing bureaucracy of standard hospital boards. She opened a clinic for the people who couldn't go to normal hospitals, syndicate soldiers, undocumented dock workers, and anyone from the neighborhood who couldn't afford a $5,000 ambulance ride. It was entirely illegal, deeply unethical by standard medical board guidelines, and absolutely saving lives every single day. "You're working too hard," a deep, familiar voice rumbled from the corner of the office. Clara smiled, the tension in her thick shoulders melting away instantly. Dominic was sitting in a leather armchair, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. Lorenzo stood silently by the door, acting as the most terrifying hospital security guard on the North American continent. "I'm working exactly as hard as I need to," Clara said, walking over and taking the coffee from Dominic. She took a sip, perfectly black, just how she needed it. "Besides, Tommy actually managed to offload 3 shipping containers today without dropping anything into the lake. I consider that a medical miracle." Dominic chuckled, reaching out to pull her onto his lap. Clara went willingly, settling her heavy weight comfortably across his thighs. He wrapped his arms around her wide waist, resting his chin against her chest, listening to the strong, steady thud of her heartbeat. True to his word, Dominic had erased Tommy's gambling debt. But Clara hadn't let her brother off the hook. She made Tommy work at the docks under Lorenzo's direct supervision. The sheer terror of reporting to a mob hitman every morning at 5 a.m. had miraculously cured Tommy of his gambling addiction and turned him into an incredibly punctual forklift driver. "The commission meets tomorrow," Dominic murmured, closing his eyes as Clara ran her fingers through his dark hair. "They want to know if you're attending." Clara snorted. "Do they have medical questions, or are they just terrified I'm going to poison their cannolis if they cross you?" "A little bit of both." Dominic smiled against her scrubs. "Moretti insists you sit at the table. He says you have a better strategic mind than half his capos." It was true. Clara had become an unofficial consigliera. Her deep understanding of human physiology translated terrifyingly well to mob interrogations and negotiations. She could tell when a rival boss was lying by watching their pulse points. She could predict violent outbursts by observing pupil dilation. The Chicago underworld didn't just respect Dominic Russo. They were utterly terrified of his fat, immovable, fiercely intelligent wife. "I have a double shift here tomorrow," Clara said, kissing the top of his head. "Tell Moretti he can bring the ledgers to the clinic if he wants my opinion." But he has to wear shoe covers. I just had the floors sterilized. Dominic laughed. A rich, joyous sound that had been entirely absent from his life before a bleeding night in the St. Jude emergency room. He tilted his head back, looking up into the eyes of the woman who had pulled him back from the brink of death and rebuilt his empire with a stethoscope and a spine of steel. "I love you, Clara," Dominic said, the words carrying the weight of an absolute vow. Clara smiled, leaning down to capture his lips in a slow, deep kiss that tasted of bitter coffee and undeniable power. "I know," she whispered against his mouth. "Now let me get back to work. These gunshot wounds aren't going to heal themselves." Dominic watched her walk out of the office, her wide hips swaying, her posture commanding absolute authority. She was no longer just the night nurse who saved his life. She was the Queen of Chicago. And as long as Clara Russo held the line, his empire would never fall. If you were captivated by Clara's fierce resilience and Dominic's lethal devotion in Pretend You're My Wife, don't let the story end here. We bring you the most intense, grounded, and thrilling romance dramas where strong, real women take charge of their own destinies. Hit that like button to support stories with authentic, capable heroines. Share this with a friend who loves a good Mafia plot twist, and subscribe to our channel for more pulse-pounding original audio stories every single week. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a chapter.